All right, we're going to go ahead and get started here because we've got a lot of ground to cover and want to make sure that we have an opportunity to engage in discussion and comment with everyone. I want to thank you for joining us today to engage in this topic. We know that since 2020, states and districts have been facing unprecedented challenges and really in an effort to support all students, but specifically students who have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic, like our children with disabilities. So we're really looking forward to having your input and your feedback on the OPI's 1% cap monitoring implementation plan, as well as providing you with an opportunity to comment on our policies and procedures for our alternate assessment. So just a few housekeeping items before we get too far along here. This meeting will be recorded as a public meeting in accordance with our official public records. Excuse me. It is recorded and we will post the recording. So for folks who want to reflect back to this or share it outside with others afterwards, or those who can't attend live now, this will be recorded after the meeting and the transcript will enable us to assist with our note-taking purposes and meeting minute purposes. We will post the recording on our Google site, so that's the State 1% Cap Guidance and Monitoring Google site, and you'll be able to access all materials there at a future date. We will use some technology today to engage in comment opportunities with you, and so those Menti responses will be recorded as well. We also will provide you with an opportunity to pose questions and for us to answer if we are able to. And so any information from a Q&A standpoint in the chat may also be used for the minutes. So the purpose of this webinar is really to provide you with the opportunity to ask questions and also collect any concerns or comments that you might have on these policies. So a little more about housekeeping. We look like we're all pros here because I'm not hearing any distractions or background information coming in, but just kind of from a norm here, if you could please mute your mic unless you are sharing or posing a question with us. And we welcome you to share your video if possible, just so we can use that nonverbal information to paste and to make sure our questions get answered there and for a sense of community. If you could please clearly name yourself, and also if you're able to provide your affiliation, your school district, or kind of where you're joining us from would be great to have for the record. And please feel free to introduce yourself with the chat. So given the time that we have here, I'm not going to go through all introductions of OPI staff, but to just show you that this is not a one-person effort by any means. This is really a cross-divisional collaboration on where we're at with these things. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Ashley McGrath, and I'm the Director of Assessment for the OPI. I am joined here by my assessment unit, and they are presented here on the slide, and they will answer any questions you might have that are specific to any of the statewide assessments. Also joining us, we have Student Support Services staff on the call to answer any specific questions there that you might have, and also we have data operations team members on the call to support that as well. So given the size of the audience here and kind of the virtual nature that we have with this webinar, it'll be a little bit difficult for me to pass the mic around and kind of get your input and feedback on the comments or kind of ideas or questions that you might have on these policies. So we're going to try and use some technology here to help us gather that information. So in kind of an overview for you, we have 65 slides. I know that's a lot to cover in 1 hour. But of those 65 slides, we have 9 of these slides that are specifically designed to collect your information. And we will be following our presentation and kind of our Q&A process in accordance with this published agenda. So some kind of etiquette that we expect with public participation and rules. As I mentioned, we're going to be using that technology. For verbal comment, if you would just please introduce yourself, and if you're representing any affiliation or organization, to just kind of make that known for the record. that will allow us to make sure that we get a broad cross-section of voices in the process of meaningful, timely consultation of stakeholders. So any persons likely impacted by these policies and potential waivers should we exceed the 1%. We are going to request that everybody in attendance has their name clearly identified, again, for that record purpose. And then you can submit information to us using the Menti survey tool. You can, as I mentioned, submit it in comments or chat. And if you run into any technical issues, I tend to get those experiences here or there. So if you do have any issues, either with audio, muting, unmuting, or those kind of things, feel free to send us a chat and someone from my team will be able to assist you. So the information that we have provided to share with you today is current as of today's date. It's really covering the ground and stemming from the laws and regulation and OPI policies for testing, accountability, and reporting. And really the point of this entire webinar is having you lend your voice to the process. And so any persons likely impacted, we would like to provide an opportunity for them to submit comments or concerns regarding the implementation of these new policies and procedures that we have for the alternate assessment. So kind of looking more at the details of who are those persons likely impacted by these rules. So this document here is kind of what we've identified as the stakeholders that would likely be impacted from the educational lens of these new policies and procedures. And really, we're looking at your questions, your comments, and your concerns regarding the student identification and eligibility to participate in statewide assessments, also serving and supporting students with significant cognitive disabilities, and the monitoring and assessment pieces. That's really kind of what's new about our guidance that we're looking for feedback on. And public participation and comment in this process is very instrumental to making sure our guidance is comprehensive and supports you in your work. So I just want to draw your attention here to the public comment period. So it will take place from today's date until January 25th. So we have about 30 days that we'll have these documents open for comment, also our survey open to give you that opportunity to voice your ideas. So as I mentioned, we're going to use some technology here to get information from you. Unfortunately, I won't be kind of guiding you through the technology on my screen here, but I do have it up so I can kind of see what's happening as we submit responses. So just to kind of, I guess, a preface of this, if you have more than one device, I would recommend you use your phone or that alternative device that, especially your phone, makes it really easy to kind of submit information and follow along with any of the content we have presented on the screen. And I've set up the tool so it can be completed at your own pace. So that means is you can go faster or slower at which I'm pacing through the slides. And this survey will be open for 2 days. You could come back to it. So if you could right now, put that information in the chat, Marcy, so that we can have folks go to menti.com with that link and enter the code. So for the next question, they can share a little bit of who they are and where they're joining us from. So the first question in Menti is, where are you joining us from? Enter your 5-digit zip code. All right, Jacob, do we see some information coming in there?
Yes, we've got a number of responses coming up right now.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Jacob's our poll runner here, so he's given me information on the fly about responses here since the technology was not in my favor when we were setting up the webinar. So I'm going to advance to the next question here. And if you could please indicate the size of your school district or region using these options. If you're not affiliated with a school district, just kind of do your best in that community to represent the area. For instance, a AA district, you might think of an urban kind of area. All right, and the next slide here. So this one is, what is your primary role or position? This helps us make sure that we get representation across the various educational representatives. So for instance, you could be an administrator or school leader, classroom teacher, or any of those other roles we've identified there. And just as a reminder, again, you can move ahead of me or slower, so don't feel like I'm rushing you to complete any of this information. All right, great, thank you guys. So with that, that kind of covers the first section of our published agenda. So I wanted to give an opportunity to pause to see if you had any questions before we kind of run into the heart of today's agenda and really dive into the policy pieces. So give a moment to see if anybody wants to come off mute or post anything in the chat or any questions on the first topic of the agenda. All right, I'm not hearing any or seeing any posted in the chat, so I'm going to move on to the next section here. So one of the important pieces as we talk about students with significant cognitive disabilities and the policies and procedures for alternate statewide assessments is really to be mindful of student privacy under IDEA and FERPA. It's really critically important for these students. So I always kind of think about it as it's definitely a benefit to have information, especially about these achievement data for these students, but to really balance that with the need to safeguard and protect that student information. So throughout this presentation, the comment process, and in serving these students, we really want to be responsible and accountable for protecting and safeguarding that PII, so the personally identifiable information. So this is just our reminder as we have conversations about these students and these topics and these policies to maintain student confidentiality. So in this section, we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the participation requirements for this assessment, also kind of the general assessment and what that means in relation to the alternate assessment and some definitions. So we're going to focus under Essa specifically on section 1111B, and this is really in regards to the requirements for delivering statewide assessments. So as you can see on my slides here, there are other pieces that kind of are touched upon when we talk about students with significant cognitive disabilities being served under alternate assessments. But we're really going to stay in just that one zone, which is that testing section 1111B. And we're going to talk about policies and procedures for identification, participation, administration, scoring, and delivering that information or those reports to families. And so when we think about kind of all of these student groups and guidelines, really want you to kind of focus in on this area as opposed to the other implications. We'll like broadly touch on these things, but not go into any great depth or detail. So just to begin and kind of make sure everybody is at the same table with information, so these requirements stem from both state and federal law and regulation. In 2017, the U.S. Department of Education released the Consolidated State Plan, and those were essentially created so that parents and the public were essentially assured of the transparent and quality information about how the OPI or the state and districts were going to meet all of those requirements under ESSA for each federal program. This graphic just kind of simplifies that exchange of information and what that means as far as kind of those policies, if you will. And just kind of in general, that is our commitment on how these alternate assessments will be implemented respectively within the school districts. So this is a section, this is kind of looking outside of that section B that we talked about. It's a little into the section C in that section H, but I wanted to just use this to kind of clarify how the alternate assessment is integrated in these sections. So the single statewide assessment system that we use for the accountability process, it's been simplified on this slide. If you want more details into that, you can look at Montana's Essa state plan in table F. We use a single system of statewide assessments, so we don't have a menu of assessments, if you will. We have one for each of the required content areas, and that's specific to either the K-8 space or the high school space. And within these indicators, specifically looking at that indicator 1 on the slide, the academic achievement, the state factors that we are of importance for today's conversation are regards to that 95% participation requirement. And so alternate assessments within that math and ELA space, they are included within that indicator 1 and also that indicator 2. And then just kind of how that is addressed within the accountability system. Again, if you want more information, we can share that at a future point. So all students, including students with disabilities and English learners, are required to participate in state assessments either with or without accommodation. So this document that we have on the slide here is the policies and procedures for all state assessments, so not specific to the alternate. And I've highlighted on the slide here for you some of those participation options. So generally, if a student can receive instruction, they are expected to participate in state assessment. So under IDEA, this prompted the creation of a range of those options we're just talking about. So you can either participate in the general population assessment without accommodation, or participate in the general population assessment with accommodation, or participate in the alternate assessment when the participation criteria is met. And these participation options are reported both by the state and federally within our reporting systems. So serving all students, some language on this slide that I think is meaningful for us in our conversations about these new policies. So the decision to move a special education student to an alternate assessment has significant implications for the path the student will take in their K-12 career. It means that the student will not be able to participate in the general education curriculum, even when provided accommodation. A student who participates in the alternate assessment requires a modified curriculum. And when we think about serving students with these educational services, it's important to ensure all children have fair, equal, and significant opportunity to obtain high-quality education and reach, at a minimum, proficiency on challenging academic content standards. So really thinking about the civil rights of our students to ensure that access and opportunity, thinking about the implications of these policies when we're serving students with disabilities, whether that's a Section 504 plan or under IDEA for the free appropriate public education or FAPE, so that they have that opportunity to participate in testing regardless of the educational setting. So we're going to kind of now walk through some non-examples of things not to consider when thinking about participation. Then we're going to get into the new criterion. So participation decisions may not be based on. So I guess just to be very clear and transparent, in Montana, there is no opt-out law. We require all public schools and accredited schools to participate in assessments and to provide the opportunity to all students. So only under certain limited conditions can students be exempted from participation. And in these rare, unique situations, they may be unable to participate due to a significant documented medical reason. So if that were true, those instances where a medical reason does qualify, the school is not penalized for the student's absence or inability to participate in the statewide assessment. but non-participation for any other reason can negatively impact the participation rate calculation. So IEP teams cannot determine that a child will not participate in the assessment. That is a violation of their civil rights. They need to be afforded the opportunity. So on this slide, we just have some examples. These are also included within the guidelines that we've made available for comment, and just some examples. So do not make participation decisions based on disability, excessive absences, social, cultural, or economic differences, expected poor performance, and some others that are offered on the slide. So just as kind of a bottom line statement, it is never allowable to exclude students based on expected performance, difficulty administering the assessment, disability status, or English learner status. So what the OPI has done is essentially taken the National Center of Educational Outcomes recommended strategies to use that to build a more comprehensive policies and procedures for participation in the alternate assessment. And so here are the 5 recommended strategies that are offered within that document. So district and school current participation rates on the alternate assessment. It's important really to have that information to know the landscape of what participation looks like across districts, across schools. Characteristics of students participating in the alternate assessment. And for each of these 5, I'm going to kind of, walk more detail or fine grain look at what that means for each of these within the policies we've created. A state definition for what it means to be a student with the most significant cognitive disabilities, professional development for IEP teams and other educators who participate in this process. And really very important in this is working with parents of students with disabilities. So this is the resource that we've made available for comment. This is the alternate assessment eligibility guidelines. It kind of is going through all the information that I'm sharing with you in this webinar in a narrative form. And so as you can see here, there are 8 chapters included in here. And we would like your comment on this before January 25th. So IDEA requires that states have developed and implemented guidelines for the participation of children with disabilities in the alternate assessment, and for those children who cannot participate in regular assessments and accommodations as indicated in their IEP. It is the OPI's responsibility to define who the students with significant cognitive disabilities are, and also to establish clear and appropriate guidelines for IEP teams to follow, and really to set those parameters and direction that these decisions are not made based on some of those non-examples that I offered before. So this is a look at the OPI's current definition for students with significant cognitive disabilities. This is also open within comment, either in that public comment survey or also directly within the alternate assessment eligibility guidelines for you to provide us with input and feedback on. So when we look at the definition here, the first assumption is that the child meets the 4 participation criteria as described in Appendix A. And then the additional details to define more clearly what characteristics are represented by a student who participates in the alternate assessment based on this definition. And as opposed to reading this slide, because we will make this available for you at a future date, I just want to go to the bottom of here that our definition is not necessarily and is not determined by an IQ test score, but rather that holistic look at who the student is and that information included above. So these are the 4 criterion. So this is a different form than what's currently in place. And again, that's why we want to provide that opportunity for comment, again, by that January 25th deadline. So Some assumptions that are included within this form is that IEP teams are consulting that AIM collection schedule to reference important test registration information for participation in the alternate assessments. We use essentially those data collections to mass register these students so that they can participate in the assessments, whether that's the math and ELA, the MSA test, or into the alternate science assessment, or our various test delivery portals. So it's very important to look at those timeframes and those deadlines within that collection schedule. Another thing to have IEP teams think about is consider the testing cycles that occur during the student's IEP year, and to include in making those decisions for participation in alternate assessments some suitable instructional time before the test windows open, before expecting them to have those, meet those expectations on a statewide assessment. So what I've done is just taken those 4 participation criteria here and kind of reduced them to these 4 buckets. So the first one, does the student have a significant cognitive disability? Again, that coincides with that definition. So looking at this item, you can look at student records to indicate if the student has a disability or multiple disabilities that significantly impact intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior. On the second one, does the student have an active IEP and receive services under IDEA? So really looking at that accurate information included in AIM or Infinite Campus to make sure it is up to date and makes sure those students are shown as eligible for participation in those assessments. The third component here are the question, do the students' demonstrated cognitive abilities and adaptive behavior require substantial adjustments or modifications to the general curriculum? So kind of looking at that age-appropriate grade level content information, variability with depth and breadth or complexity and learning expectations. So making sure that these standards for expectation for the students are linked to the state standards. And so that's a little bit different. So as an example, we have our math and ELA content standards that are essentially written into rule under Chapter 53. But with those, we have essentially core connectors that are the standards that are linked to those state adopted standards. And the fourth component here is, does the student require direct and extensive instruction to acquire, maintain, generalize, and transfer new skills? And so even including multiple settings. So those are the revisions to that form, or those criterion. And at least for me, it was helpful to kind of think about the compare and the contrast. There's a lot of similarities across these. So to provide some context for veteran school officials who have been doing this for quite a while, the participation criterion are the same or similar in that looking at like new criterion 2, it relates in a lot of ways to the former criterion 1. And it's really intended for students to be served under IDEA and those determinations to be made by an IEP team. Also looking at the criterion, the new criterion 3, substantial adjustments or modifications to the general curriculum relates in a lot of ways to the former criterion 2. And the criterion 4 from the new version compared with the old is also very similar, but in this new version, it has added language to it to essentially say the ability to maintain, generalize, and transfer new skills across academic content areas in multiple settings. So kind of the differences then, if you will, the new criterion 1, child must have a significant cognitive disability, is somewhat similar to the third former criterion, but there's been adjustments there to really make sure that it's in accordance with the reauthorization of ESEA or of Essa. So that boils down to some of the evolution that we've seen prior to 2015 with the reauthorization of Essa. So really to ensure high expectations for all students. So what was kind of the phenomena or the reason behind these revisions in the late 90s and early 2000s. There was kind of this prevalent belief that students with significant cognitive disabilities could not learn academic content or could only learn very basic skills. And this prevalent belief maintained, and in fact, the percentages of students participating in these assessments continued to grow substantially despite emerging evidence. So really the point of updating our policies and procedures is to make sure that they are strongly compliant with the requirements under Essa for maintaining high expectations for all students. So looking at these are for the alternate academic achievement standards. These are the same but different from the standards-based expectations that we have for our general content standards. Students who participate in these alternate assessments participate fully in big ideas and activities of the grade level curriculum so that they can build those skills and the knowledge. So in kind of thinking about what this means, we recommend focusing on what students can do and essentially avoiding statements of they can't statements. So this is a look at those general education standards and state assessments. And so all of these standards have been adopted by the Montana Board of Public Education. These are, required standards in all public schools in these content areas. And when we look at IDEA, it really has those established goals for the performance of children with disabilities in the state that are consistent to the maximum extent practicable with the other goals and standards that are in place for children in the state. So looking then, well, what does that mean for the alternate state assessment? And this is a look at the essentially same but different standards that we have for these alternate achievement standards and what assessments have been essentially implemented to assess those expectations for students. And so Montana was a member, is a member of the Multi-State Alternate Assessment Consortium, or MSA, and that group really was created as a result of the Office of Special Education Programs within the U.S. Department of Education for the grant under the National Center and State Collaborative, or NCSIC. And so we leveraged a lot of those resources and our membership within that grant and that work to design, develop, and deliver our alternate statewide assessment. So that's where we've essentially taken that robust information from to essentially have in place the MSAA, the AMSA, and then alternate access for ELS. So this is another one of those documents we're looking to have comment or feedback on by that January 25th date. And it's a decision flow chart, again, intended to assist IEP teams in making those decisions on whether or not a student should participate in the alternate state assessment. So unfortunately, my animations for some reason aren't working the way I decided that they should. Technology, friend or foe. So with this needs-based approach, essentially what I've done is looked at the 6 kind of steps within the IEP editor that we have for essentially assisting in these decisions for participation in these assessments. So when we talk about the IEP statewide assessment editor, it's collecting information in this hierarchy. So I'll kind of start with number 1, which is that participation decision, and kind of go to the bottom. So the first question within here is, how will the student participate in state assessments? And as you have heard me share, there isn't a non-option. The 3 participation ranges to select from are with accommodation, without accommodation, or the alternate assessment checkbox. And again, using that Appendix A form that we have to support in these decisions. The second component here is what assessment is this accommodation and or support required for? So determining which state assessment we're talking about. The next question then is, what content area is this accommodation and support required for. So depending on the content area, an accommodation may or may not be appropriate depending on that constructive interest for whether that's math or ELA or science. And the fourth question here identifies the reason that accommodation and or support is required. And the fifth selects accommodation. So we've essentially looked across all of our accommodation guidelines across our 6 statewide assessments, and I've made those options available as kind of a drop-down menu, a cascade of options for it to select from. And the sixth one, the notes to document information there. So we've done a lot of work here to build this, and also across other special population students. So for instance, Section 504 plans or English learners, we now have across those 3 groups, IEP, 504, EL, the test setting collections in place under the AIM Infinite Campus process. So I apologize that my uncovering of these items didn't work the way it was. Oh, there it goes. Or maybe I just have to click. Didn't do that on the other one. Oh, dear Lord. Sorry, all. Well, now you can see. Sometimes it's your friend. So I'd like to pause here to just see if there are any questions on the OPI's policies or procedures for alternate assessments. So you can submit that within Menti, within the chat, or you could also come off mute if you'd like. How's our poll running, Jacob? Are things going well?
Yeah, no questions so far though on this question, on this Menti slide.
Thank you. I'm going to advance the slide, but again, please feel free to take your time in submitting any comment. And also throughout the slides, you have an opportunity to react to some. And also anytime a question is relevant on the information we have to share, you can submit a question or comment to us. So this brings us to this section of the agenda, and this is really looking at participation requirements. So as I mentioned, kind of that gradually increasing essential group of students that were participating under the alternate assessment option. Historically, we essentially grew in kind of looking nationwide at the phenomena to where 2/3 of the states had participation rate greater than 1% in the 2014-2015 school year. And so in addition, researchers kind of looked at these states and the participation reasons and found some unusual patterns. And they seemed to kind of identify, as they dug a little bit deeper, some inconsistent decision making that was happening that caused some concerns. So kind of taking witness to all of these things, made recommendations through the larger groups and educational organizations. And so as a result of the current research and efforts in that area, we had the reauthorization of Essa, which again focuses on participation, but also introduced that 1% state cap. So to explain a little bit here about what the participation elements are, there are a couple when we talk about 1%. So first, just kind of give the general overview. Essa requires that states demonstrate that at least 95% overall and for student subgroups consisting of 10 or more students, such as children with disabilities, have participated in the required content areas. This kind of looking at a waiver application gets further disaggregated down into grades. So for grade for math, reading, and science. So if we look at here on how we calculate under the accountability reporting process for what participation is, this graphic just kind of shows you how we do that 95% participation calculation. So when we look at the denominator here, one of the things that happens if a school submitted a non-participation request for medical reason to the OPI, this means that the office will look at that information, and if it is a qualifying medical reason, then that medical exemption would not count against the school within this process, so it would be removed from that denominator. When we look at the 1% cap on the alternate assessments, so as I mentioned, Essa imposes that 1%, and it's kind of just a very basic one here. So the number of students participating in the alternate versus total number of students participating in statewide assessments. So what we know about kind of those rules behind the 1% state cap is that Essa prohibits the OPI from placing participation caps on school districts, but it does have a responsibility of the state to essentially monitor districts that exceed the 1% and kind of review the rationale or justifications for exceeding that. And so should the state overall exceed the 1% cap, we would be required to submit a waiver. So this is kind of our preemptive effort to make sure our guidelines and our information is clear and made available across the board for all schools. So Montana's student response check and early stopping rule. So the reason I've included this information within the slide deck is it essentially has been included in the alternate assessment eligibility guidelines, and it is kind of procedural information to assist with the participation calculation. So the early stopping rule, the purpose of the student response protocols, is looking at the MSA and the AMSA to determine if the student has an observable response. And so the protocol ensures that these students can meaningfully participate in the state assessments and respond to items. So in order to meaningfully participate, they must be able to demonstrate a communicative mode or observable response mode. And so to kind of what do those things all look like? Those are defined at great length within the test administration manuals for both of these assessments, but in kind of a nutshell, the student response check can result in what's known as the early stopping rule. So kind of deducing that into the guidelines that are available for comment. So new as of this school year, system test coordinators can report that early stopping rule application to the OPI within the MOCCAS application for non-participation. And so each reason for non-participation due to medical reasons is handled by the OPI on a case-by-case basis. We kind of handle these on that individualized basis and use the information and evidence submitted by the district to determine if it qualifies for exemption. And should it qualify for exemption, as I mentioned, in kind of those calculations for participation, the early stopping rule could, if appropriately applied, there's no observable response, be removed from the denominator of that calculation. So what does that kind of look at, like a 30,000-foot overview, looking at step one, and this is kind of going through the student response check process to potential early stopping rule or ESR to MOCCAS application. So from that point forward, so you administer the alternate assessment, and then you're administering it in accordance with the test-specific guidelines. So looking at those student response checks that are described within those test administration manuals. If no observable response is witnessed by the test administrator, again, follow those rules within the manuals to see if it's appropriate to apply the early stopping rule or that ESR. And if it is properly conducted before closing that test or opportunity to the student, it can be applied. And then going forward on the timeline here, so after that point, the student is no longer participating or persisting within the assessment. So that reason for non-participation can then be reported after all test opportunities have expired by the system test coordinator in that MOCCAS application. So really, this is really just to make sure that it's accurate and indicative when we look at participation of what is actually happening out there in the field. So I'm going to pause here now to see if there are any questions on the policies, procedures specific to participation.
So we've got a few questions in here, Ashley. I don't know if you want to address them now or.
I'm happy to come to them at the end. I think we've got about 10 minutes here left, and we could revisit those at the end if that works, or is there anything burning that needs to be addressed now before we move on to the next section?
No, I mean, I think if you want to revisit them at the end, there are 4 questions in here right now, so you should have time.
All right, great, thank you. Okay, well, I'm going to advance then to the next section. This is building that 1% data use analysis plan. And so if you're not familiar kind of with what's transpired over the years since the reauthorization of Essa, this document kind of outlines the directions from the U.S. Department of Education to states on the requirements for assessing students with alternate assessment, looking at that first memo in 2017. So recently, on October 29th, we received a memo of the requirements requesting a waiver. And in this memo, it essentially included some flexibility on the participation aspect. So as I kind of walk through the participation, and it shared that to successfully receive a waiver, the state would have to demonstrate 95% participation. It essentially, the memo recognizes, or the department recognizes, that this past academic year, it may not have been possible for states to have met that participation requirement. So in March of last year, the OPI received an accountability and reporting waiver, essentially waiving the requirement for 95% participation, as we were unable to meet that across all of our assessments. So this is to give us a little bit of flexibility there. And for just kind of an outline on here, so on the next slide, I'll show you 20 steps that we've identified across the entire academic year of ways in which the OPI can assist districts in monitoring essentially students participating in these alternate assessments. And so to begin our process, so it's really timely and relevant now, which is why we're holding the webinar. We use that credible IEP test registration data from the December 1st collection. So that December snapshot, if you're curious, you can refer to the collection schedule, helps us essentially get a preview of what students are expected to participate in the alternate assessment. It helps give us a sense on whether or not we should be planning to essentially make those waivers. We also review and look at technical assistance and monitoring information, specifically looking at that learner characteristics inventory. And if we were to exceed that 1% cap, essentially just implement broader training plans, kind of targeted assistance to support districts that may have locally exceeded the 1%, as I mentioned, and just across the board, larger technical assistance to all schools. So I know this is a lot of information and it's really small on your screen, so we're not going to walk through all of these, but to kind of know what they are and look at them and provide us with feedback and input, these are published in the alternate assessment eligibility guidelines. So you can take your time and kind of walk through those, see if they make sense, see if you have questions, and again, submit that comment to us. And so there are a lot of kind of steps, if you will, for a state to make a waiver request should the OPI exceed that 1%. So we're kind of hovering right there, borderline, and again, kind of the need and the importance of this conversation in this webinar with folks. So a state must follow the requirements under Section 8401 of Essa to submit a waiver, must also adhere to the SEA and LEA monitoring responsibilities. So again, not putting on place of a restriction for districts on that 1%, but essentially providing technical assistance and justification information should they exceed. Provide oversight on the eligibility criteria to support IEP decisions on participation and assessments. And then there are consequences of exceeding 1% cap and not making waiver requests or going through kind of the steps that are written into law. So I'll pause there to see if you guys have any questions on the OPI's 1% data analysis and use plan. All right, not hearing any. We're seeing you in the chat. Advance the next slide. And this section is about kind of unpacking all of those pieces, resources to assist folks in understanding a little bit more about each of these topics that we've talked about. So should the OPI provisionally exceed that 1% cap based on that IEP test registration information, then we would need to submit a waiver no later than Tuesday, December 14th, because one of the requirements under Essa is that it's submitted 90 days prior to the test window opening. So this is just a look at our test windows. One of the things that's helpful in providing training and providing technical assistance to districts is utilizing the OPI's Learner Characteristics Inventory, or that LCI data. This is collected under the MSA administration. So that's in grades 3 through 8 and 11. And we use that really to look at the characteristics of students with the most significant cognitive disabilities to get a general picture across the group on kind of judging what it looks like for those students who are participating in the assessment. So it's some context, some information to help us understand a little bit more about these students who are participating. And then really, if we find instances in which there may be disagreement between the information that's collected in the LCI survey tool or generally in our conversations with districts that exceed that 1%, at that point, then the OPI Student Support and Service unit would be able to have further training and technical assistance opportunities when we think about these data. As I mentioned at the very beginning, parent notification is really important. So it's required under IDEA. We have resources available here. We also have this MSA parent brochure to support folks with an understanding a little bit more about participation in these alternate assessments. But I think it's worth kind of pausing here to just reinforce that idea of making sure parents clearly are informed of what it means to have their child participate in these alternate assessments, because as I mentioned earlier, it does have significant implications for their K-12 career. So the test, an element of looking at delivering an alternate assessment is that the state's required to make sure general and special education teachers and other appropriate staff know how to administer the assessments and make appropriate use of accommodations for students with disabilities. So on the next 3 slides, just a tour, if you will, of our state assessments and resources there. So the MSA, we've got links on the slide here to kind of provide training information for those various roles we just talked about. This assessment is aligned and derived from the state standards. It has many built-in supports to help the students take the test and communicate what they know and can do as independently as possible. And really, I just encourage you to kind of view these resources for more information. The science alternate assessment, the same as here. We also, with this, have a program overview video to kind of support training and orientation activities with staff. And then the alt ELP, the same is true here. The difference with the alternate ELP is really the participation information. So the participation for our English language proficiencies is because it's a different tool and has different stakes than the other assessments, is really meeting that requirement of 100% participation to make sure that these students are progressing through their K-12 career so that they can graduate prepared and able for success. So some questions as we think about training activities. We have just released our STC workshop series for system test coordinators. So if they were unable to attend that or someone wants, those fundamental concepts on these key topics of test administration, test accessibility, test security, and training, that is your point. And really it's just intended for district level staff to maintain the integrity of the assessment. And so some questions as we think about preparing for the alternate assessments or assessments in general. Do you know how long the student should take the test? So breaks are very much encouraged when we talk about supporting students with significant cognitive disabilities. Do you have those planned breaks? Essentially, do parents, teachers, principals know how to use the performance information? What procedures for including students are in place? How about the procedures to ensure that they participate with, without, or in the alternate accommodations as appropriate? And some others here that are helpful to guide you in thinking, more deeply in planning and preparing for delivering these state assessments. So this question here, to summarize that section, is any on building capacity. And then the last couple of slides here, I know we're about at the top of the hour, are on the public comment tool options. So this webinar is one example of engaging in the process in providing us with comment. And I'll kind of transition then to the other options as you kind of complete those questions at your pace. We have a Google site that centralized all this information for you. We have the public comment survey, and it is broken up into 4 sections. So 1, adequate notice of requirement, steps in information on monitoring and implementation procedures, training technical assistance, and accountability. And we have resources that we share out on a frequent basis. So our assessment bulletin, we publish a lot of information on these assessments, so including the alternate assessments on a monthly basis. We also host webinars that are on that first link. I shared this document at the beginning, and that's that general participation in state assessments. We also have the ELA, English learner guidance, and this would be specific criteria for students with significant cognitive disabilities who are English learners. Criteria workshop, so this is the former Criterion, so that would be replaced as we propose after January 25th in opportunity for comment on our new policies and procedures. This is a resource to work with educators, school leaders, parents, and others on participation. Accessibility resources, our mock test application. So if one of your responsibilities is submitting non-participation information for medical reasons, that information. So are there any questions on our various public comment tools or resources? And is there anything else you believe the OPI should consider in preparing guidance, training, and technical assistance to support the implementation of these policies? So with that summarizes the content that we had to share with you. So if you were looking to receive a renewal unit certificate for attending today's session, Marcy will share in the chat with you the information to complete that request. And otherwise, we're going to hang out on the line here to either review and answer some of the questions that were submitted in the Mente survey, or if you would like to come off mute and pose any questions at this time or submit them in chat, we'll kind of walk through and make sure we get this addressed. All right, Jacob, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can bring up the questions through the survey and share it that way so we can kind of walk through and address any of those.
Sure thing. Give me 1 second here. So there are a few questions posed for the Menti survey questions number 4 and 5. So here are the number 4 questions.
Okay, thank you. So that first question on initiation of contact. So the OPI gathers and collects information from AIM and Infinite Campus. And so as long as the IEP is locked, we're able to see if that selection for alternate assessment has been made. And so students with that flag information included in there will be registered within the various test delivery systems, or those portals. So if we find instances when we get to the point of monitoring and kind of reviewing whether or not districts are exceeding that, at that point, we would have the opportunity to reach out for further justification and kind of clarification on those reasons and work with you. So I hope that answers that question, but if not, please feel free to come off mute so I can make sure that we get that answered. Next one here. I'm not sure which conversation we're talking about. Maybe it's using these forms to support decisions with the alternate assessment. Don't know if somebody would like to clarify if that's the direction we should be leaning here.
Yeah, this is Jason in Great Falls. That was one that I posted. That's exactly right. I was wondering, I mean, it looks like a 6-page, procedure to follow. Do you see this embedded in the IEP? Is this a different meeting outside of the IEP? We're pulling in a lot of evaluative kind of information as well. So I was just wondering, like, time, has this been piloted at all, or, where do you see it occurring, this discussion?
Thank you, Jason. I'll definitely let John answer kind of when this conversation would happen. I guess for some historical context on the origination of the information. So we took the former Criterion, which I believe was 2 or 3 pages, and essentially just took some information from our membership in the consortium. So for instance, we have a lot of state partners that we work with in the MSA consortium. So this has been implemented in other states and has been a successful model. And we talked about kind of using this as a document for assistance that could be included within the IEP. But John, do you want to maybe provide some information there to talk about the win and those aspects? If you're talking, John, I think you're on mute.
There, I think I unmuted. Are we there?
Yes, yes, okay. I can hear you now.
I couldn't find the button. I think to answer the question, is a separate meeting necessary for prior to the alternate assessment? I think those discussions are primarily going to could revolve around at the time of the actual IEP meeting, because you're going to be identifying things like what kinds of things are going to be utilized for the alt assessment. This is obviously, as Ashley said, it's a very small population that is going to be utilizing this assessment. And so a meeting, it's pretty much like a life skills group of population that we're looking at here. And so those kids would be, you could have a meeting with the parent to discuss what kinds of things are going to be applicable for that assessment, or for the student to have some success with the assessment. Did I answer that?
Yes, you actually answered one of my other questions as well, in that are we just doing this procedure with students that we're considering the alternate for, or are we doing it for all students to rule out the need for it in the first place?
I guess I don't know that answer. Some versus all, I don't know the answer to that one.
I think it would be beneficial for borderline students, so students who don't know whether or not they should participate in the general ed assessment with accommodations, or students that would benefit from the alternate assessment. And of course, I'm not expert in this area by any means, but there is, as you read the guidelines, it's pretty clear in looking at what characteristics might describe a student who would be eligible for these assessments. So it's not necessary that this form would be applicable to all IEP students in a lot of ways. And I think the guidelines make that clear about kind of things to look for. And there's some frequently asked questions in there as well to kind of help say, okay, these might be conversations we would want to have with students who are borderline, or students that we're considering. Does that help answer your question, Jason?
Yeah, it does. I was in my brain relating it kind of similar to an ESY type conversation, where in the past I've tried to use that same rationale, but we were directed that no, we need to be having that with all students, even those that we, are far from ESY type eligibility. So that's where I just was a little confused, but thank you for clarifying.
Yes, thank you for the great questions. And you know, Montana, just generally speaking, we've done really well at being at or below the 1% overall, but because we're at that 1%, we just are really wanting to make sure this guidance, this information is made available to assist IEP teams, especially as our overall population continues to grow. And looking here then at the next question. So John, could you maybe provide best practices for kind of making sure IEPs are up to date and those things? I think that's kind of where this green question is looking at, kind of how often to be evaluated.
Sure. I think the population we are looking at does not see a great deal of growth in cognitive abilities. We hope that there is some growth, but overall, there's a good chance that it would be pretty constant. And so the test scores don't necessarily need to be current test scores, but certainly some of the observations that you put in PLAF statements for the IEPs could be utilized as some of the rationale for justification of taking the test.
Thank you, John.
Yeah.
Jacob, were there any other questions we should address?
Yes, let me move this forward here to question number 5.
Oh, a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Thank you. So one of the enhancements with these guidelines to answer that first question on whether or not STCs would report non-participation with the early stopping rule would be that information, when an early stopping rule has been applied, is that it would be reported in the MONCAS application. Again, that is intended to address that participation calculation and to kind of make that as accurate as possible for students who can meaningfully participate in statewide assessments versus those students who cannot. Not sure how to answer the next question. Does 1% of what? I'm not really remembering where we're at in that presentation of material. So if the submitter wants to clarify, please feel free to come off mute. I'd be happy to answer that.
I'm sorry, this is me again. I was going crazy with my questions. Jason in Great Falls. So again, 1%, I know we say we can't exceed 1%, but I'm trying to get down to 1% of what is that? We're a large district. Is it our total district population of students, just students in IDEA services with IEPs? And then is it broken down further than district? Is it just by school or by grade level? And 1% of what, I guess, is kind of the target of that. And while I'm saying it, the other question on here is mine as well, is about a large district. And I think they kind of blend together because we absorb quite a few students from surrounding areas with high needs because we offer those specialized programs for students. And so again, that kind of impacts our 1% of 1% of what, because we're not bringing in necessarily a generalized sample. It's a very specific subset of students who come in with a very specific purpose to access certain programs that we offer.
Yes, thank you. That helps clarify my answer very much. So I just want to kind of go back to that Essa language. So although the state is held to that requirement of 1%, we cannot essentially make districts adhere to 1%. So there are definite examples across the state where districts will exceed 1% for students who are participating in this assessment. And essentially in those instances, what we're looking to do, especially if the overall state exceeded, is have a conversation to look at the explanation for those students participating. So for instance, in your description of high needs and some of the characteristics where essentially you may have students attending your campuses to receive services, then that would be a really appropriate explanation of why it's in excess in that particular district. So by no means are the LEAs required to adhere to the 1% cap. The state overall is. It's the OPI's responsibility to monitor and provide technical assistance should districts exceed 1%, just to make sure that the guidelines have been implemented with fidelity. Students that may have a disparity in the information of having the early stopping rule applied with, let's say, the learner characteristic inventory, that conversation's taken place, or students who are really high performing in the assessment consistently over time. Maybe they have been inappropriately identified to participate in this assessment and would actually benefit from participating in the general assessment with accommodation, so that we're maintaining those high expectations for the student. Does that help answer your question, Jason?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
I think the next question was, does ESR count as non-participation? Hopefully I'm correct there. And so currently the process for ESRs that have been applied are included within the participation calculation, but with these new policies and guidelines that we've opened up for comment, what we would be doing, as I answered with the first question on the slide, is asking system test coordinators to report it as an instance of non-participation due to the reason that the student cannot meaningfully participate in the assessment due to that medical reason. So to answer the question about load and information, so I guess to answer this is not new. As Essa was reauthorized, this has been in place since 2015. We've had these guidelines in place for some time. So the things that are new is that the form's been updated to, again, maintain those high expectations for serving these students with the alternate academic achievement standards. Another component of this is we're trying to make that participation calculation as accurate as possible, so benefiting districts through this process and making sure that the state overall is compliant with that 1% cap. So this is really just making our guidance more clear, but it is not new federal or state requirements. And so for what has been piloted and those things, as I mentioned earlier in your questions, Jason, this has been implemented in other states that we are a member with through the consortium. And we have had multiple conversations about this over the years, and it's just really a matter of timing to get it in place. And I think we answered the last question there.
Sure.
First. Sorry,
Ashley,
John.
sorry, can I follow up with that question? The one about the time-consuming piece. It's been my experience as a director and as a principal that the alternative assessment can be administered over the window is fairly wide open. And so to expect a student to work on the alternative assessment for even an hour at a time it can be challenging. And so the opportunity for smaller testing sessions is certainly at your discretion as the teacher, case manager, as a school. You can if you can only keep a student's attention for 15 minutes, okay, fine, and then you move on to your instructional day. It can be time consuming, yes. But for the most part, it can be broken up into several smaller chunks that it might be a little more palatable for the day or even the classroom setting.
Thank you, John. And that's very helpful, and it adheres to our best practices within the test administration manuals as well. We want to make sure they have ample opportunities to fully demonstrate what they know and can do. Other questions, Jacob, that we should address?
I did not see any earlier, but we can sure check right now. There were no questions to mentee question number 6 or number 7.
So for those of you who are still on the call, oh, sorry, Jacob.
Sorry, there is one question in the public comment.
It is possible. I think by exit, at first I was like, can you show me the question? So it is possible that a student could move from the alternate assessment into the general assessment with accommodations. We have definitely seen that. I think that's what was meant by exit. But the opportunity to participate in assessments is still required. So it's a little bit different than like the exit kind of things that we do with it for like the alt English language proficiency assessment and what that means for the student. For those of you who are still with us here, I'd like to provide you with the opportunity to come off mute and ask any questions you might have or share any comment or concerns you might have. This would be the time.
So on page 3 of the document that you had sent to us today, where it talks about just the sources of evidence for Criterion 1, for example, results of individual cognitive test, results of adaptive behavior, individual reading assessments, all that type of thing. So within the IEP, once this is adopted, if it is, would we go through each of those and explain it, or just checks the box that those were considered?
So in some of these, I'm trying to get my computer up and running as fast as yours, Lisa. In some of these, there's a section for description. So in the sections for descriptions, you could enter that information there. And this is also, your educational record of in consultation with parents, for instance, about the decision to move that child to the alternate assessment. So some of the places here to document the reasons would be helpful. And then in other examples, for instance, where there's not a description or explanation source, that would just be the kind of those check boxes.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
It does.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is there someone that we can talk with to kind of seek some advice about how to think this through and make sure, especially for those kiddos that are maybe close but not quite there? And then also, I missed one of the slides. I think it was slide 20. I was trying to find my phone so I could take a picture of it, and then when I came back, it was gone. It just said that the kiddos that am I right that if they take the alternate assessment that they are not accessing the general education curriculum at all? Did I read that right?
I think that one was about the general education curriculum, that the alternate academic achievement standards are derived and linked to the general state achievement standards, but they are different. So they're the same and different, if you will. And I think Dwayne in the chat put information about the core content connectors. So that was the difference in language. We should probably not use modified either. But to answer your question, Kim, about who could you talk to and kind of thinking through this guidance or information with specific students. John, do you want to answer who they might be able to reach out to in student support and services?
Yeah, I just shared on the chat. I just shared my phone number for you. You guys can call me. Feel free to call me, and I can try to point you in the right direction if I'm not able to answer the questions as presented.
Thank you, John. I'll give you a call. Thank you.
Yep, you bet.
And then just one last thing, Kim, we will post the slides, so you'll have access to those. We'll make those available by the end of the week on that Google site.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Are there any other questions, comments, or concerns? Not hearing any or seeing any of the chat, I just want to thank everybody for hanging in there with us and attending today and posing your questions and engaging this process. Really, this is your opportunity to lend your voice, and we want to hear from you. Your feedback and input matters, and we can't thank you enough for all you do there out in the field. So you guys have a wonderful day, and we will end our time today.